So to begin, could you just give us a bit of an introduction as to yourself and kind of your overview of your career to date?
Certainly. Hi, I'm Tonia Lovell. I am a lawyer by training and experience. I worked as a lawyer for 25 odd years. Firstly, I was at Linklaters. I did my training contract there and I stayed there for another 4 or 5 years afterwards in the corporate department. Then I moved in-house. I moved to Unilever, where I thought I'd be for a couple of years. And then about 22 years later, I found I was still there. The last few roles that I had at Unilever were Group Company Secretary, Chief Legal Officer, and a wonderful corporate governance role as well. And it was due to that co-sec role that led me actually to my exit from Unilever, because Unilever had been the subject of a takeover attempt and my role as a result was due to move to Rotterdam. So in 2018, I left Unilever, not wanting to go to Rotterdam, and I set myself up in a portfolio career, which I've done for the last 6 years, a wonderful mix of non-executive roles and professional executive coaching. My main non-exec role is with Ernst & Young, the auditing accounting firm. And my coaching now really is a niche practice focusing on in-house lawyers and company secretaries.
Amazing. So I guess to start at the kind of beginning, as it were, and to the first time that you moved into a leadership position, I appreciate you had quite a few at Unilever, but that kind of initial transition where you've got obviously great practice from being at Linklaters, you've been at Unilever for a few years. How did you kind of manage that transition into then a kind of leadership position?
You know, that first transition wasn't hard because I was absolutely ready in my career. I felt ready to be a leader. I felt that my next development opportunity was to lead a team, and I was excited about having the opportunity to do that. What was hard was landing the role. I was probably in my early 30s. I'd been a corporate lawyer for 10 years. I had moved into Unilever and was doing big, chunky corporate roles, but I knew that my next role that I wanted was to be Unilever's UK General Counsel. That was a team of 15. Really at the coalface, doing all the sort of marketing and sales work. Unfortunately, my boss didn't see that, and he placed me in a new corporate role. And so I actually had to fight to get the role that I wanted. A lesson to be learned from that, if we're going to talk in this chat about lessons learned, is and it was good that I learned it early on in my career, is if you know what you want, ask for it. Because as my boss said to me at that point, I'm not a mind reader. To me, the role I've offered you is more exciting, because he thought it was more exciting. But for me, as I said, I really wanted that leadership experience. So luckily I got the job, and I did then for the next 6 to 7 years, I managed that UK legal team at Unilever.
Amazing. It's really interesting actually to hear that you kind of tackled that head on. I mean, I guess from an advice perspective, how, is there anything that you would say to people that are kind of really eager and ready to kind of take that and kind of want to approach the situation, want to approach their manager, for that kind of role? How would you kind of recommend that people handle that kind of conversation?
As I said, proactivity, make it happen, set up a time for that conversation. But equally, I think you need to get into salesmanship. And what I've learned from the coaching that I've done, as I said, with in-house lawyers and company secretaries, is we're not very good at selling ourselves. So prepare well for a conversation like that and really work out if this is to be your first experience of, and when I'm talking about leadership here, I'm talking about leading a team. Obviously, leadership can be wider. It could be leading a project or whatever. But if you are wanting to step into your first sort of maybe head of legal role, if you've got a team that comes with that, very often you haven't had line management experience before, or perhaps you're preparing for an interview for a new role outside of your organisation. You have to work out how you can sell yourself to say, I'm ready for this. I've got the skills and experience that's necessary to lead a team. I've got the vision and the ideas as to how to lead a team. So, take a risk on me, except it won't be a risk because I'm ready and I know I'm going to make a good job of it.
Amazing. From a GC or a leadership kind of role in the legal space, how would you kind of differentiate or kind of separate the skills required from a GC to kind of be in like a business as usual kind of role, as opposed to one that's going through such a transformation?
Yes, good question. But I wonder if there ever is a time when there's business as usual, would be probably my first thought. Whether it is all the types of different corporate sort of transactions and so on that you've just mentioned that I lived through, whether it's an internal company reorganization, in these large matrix-driven companies, it's always a case of evolution. The structure changes all the time. Perhaps in smaller companies, private companies, it's all about moving up and building up to an exit, IPO or a sale, and that in itself is obviously completely transformatory. So how do you distinguish between the skills and experience that's needed? I don't think there is a standard answer for that, because it is about the fit of the GC to the company at the time, is what I would say. So you could have a GC who is strategically brilliant, who just manages risk fabulously, who is trusted by all the executive members and the board, adds value day to day in terms of what the company is doing and knows the company inside out. And maybe that person is the right person to lead a company, say, into an IPO, even if they've never done an IPO before. Maybe they need all that other experience and skills to keep the board calm, and on track, and they'll get the specialist IPO, in this case, experience from external lawyers. Or maybe, in taking the same type of example, the board decide, no, we want somebody who's led through an IPO before in here, and would go externally at that point to recruit for a GC. I think it's horses for courses. There's no one size fits all answer.
No, I absolutely agree. And I think on the recruitment side of things as well, it's definitely something that we see, because it might be somebody that looks really great on paper and has, very kind of textbook-like experience, that fits very well with the job description, but that's not necessarily somebody that from a soft skills perspective is going to be able to, to carry a specific business and kind of gel, as you say, and kind of build that kind of trust. So that absolutely makes sense. I mean, just kind of on the growth point, obviously you mentioned then kind of fundraisings and sales and IPOs. How do you, or how have you previously, from a kind of legal perspective, balanced the kind of pragmatic, growth ambitions that you often get with boards and senior leadership, with that kind of typical legal voice of, kind of reason and perhaps more risk aversion?
Yeah. Again, a wonderful question. And it takes me back to 2010 when I stepped into the role of Chief Legal Officer at Unilever. And my role then was really to pull together 300 or so odd lawyers, company secretaries, trademark agents and so on, that were all very decentralized around the globe, to pull them together into a global platform of lawyers for Unilever. And one of the very first things myself and my sort of legal management committee did was to think about legal risk. And we had, and I use this as part of my coaching now as I do it, a very simple thing. It was like Newton's cradle, the ball that swings from side to side, swinging from protecting the company all the way through to helping the company to win. And we sort of articulated to the team and amongst ourselves that that's what an in-house lawyer needs to do. Sometimes they absolutely need to protect the company. If you are a COSEC, you're with the board, you're keeping them out of jail by the things you do and the announcements you have to make and so on. But swinging through those shades of grey in the law, managing legal risk, understanding the business and the business appetite for risk, in order constantly to push to help the business to unlock new sales, growth, whatever it might be. And I think in-house lawyers need to be able to flex from one side to the other. The thing is, we all naturally probably sit somewhere along that curve. And interestingly, when I thought about it at that point, I did sit more naturally towards the protect side. Hence, I did those two roles of chief legal officer and group company secretary for 3 years, and then they split. They would come together and me. They were too big for one person with all that was going on at Unilever. And at that point, I stayed in the group company secretary role because it played to that strength of mine of being more on the protect side. But I would watch colleagues who were more IP focused, competition law focused. They were the ones perhaps more, day to day, pushing more on the win side.
Amazing. No, and it's good to hear that you were able to play to your strengths. And I think that kind of spectrum that you talk about is something that obviously we definitely see, because there's lots of lawyers that, as you say, sit on the either ends. And I think, interestingly, I've spoken to a lot of lawyers that kind of perhaps sit on more of the protective side when they're in private practice. And then after they've got 3 years experience in house, that are ready to then be so much more pragmatic and commercial with kind of how they go about it. So no, that's really interesting. So during, obviously, the different times of turbulence and uncertainty that you've mentioned at Unilever, some of that might obviously be what was going on at the business, and kind of external political factors, anything that might have been going on. How did you kind of foster, a really positive culture from that kind of leadership piece, whether it's kind of, building, growing and kind of retaining that team so that everybody, was really able to get the best out of the kind of role that they were doing individually?
Yes, I think we hear so many different phrases that I can't even remember them now in terms of this sort of uncertain world we live in. But even back from 2010, again, starting the chief legal officer role with Unilever's first externally recruited CEO, Paul Pullman, he had the phrase of VUCA world at that stage. It was all about volatile and uncertain world that we're in. And now we use different words for it. Again, I think, life at whatever point you choose is uncertain in many different ways. At the moment, it may be geopolitically uncertain, economically uncertain, but at other times there was crises over, a more heightened crises over climate and so on. So I think as in-house lawyers, managing that business risk and, aligning it with legal risk that's appropriate for the company, that will always be the tension. That will always be the job. I think, and that's quite exciting, actually. I think, if suddenly there is sales are down and you have to push towards the win side of my spectrum, then you really do put your thinking caps on and really work through what more can we do and how can we be more involved? How can we be at the right tables, be in the right places, give of our advice as early as we possibly can? How can we actually draw upon all, our years of legal and business experience and add more than just legal advice, offer up our judgment and our perhaps protecting of reputation and other risks and so on. There's so much more an in-house lawyer, particularly the more senior you get, can and should give and offer up to the business, particularly in times of trouble, than just the law. And they always do say in an executive committee in a boardroom where there is a crisis, the lawyer should be the calmest person in the room. So keeping calm, whether that's for your peer group in the committee you're in or whether you're leading a team of lawyers who are feeling unsettled, I think is extremely important. But in terms of protecting your team in these times, supporting your team, coaching your team, helping them to be resilient, I think that comes down to basic good leadership skills. And I think my learnings on that would be not just from, what I tried and tested, but from what I benefited from good leaders in my own time, is that in difficult times, communication is key. Clear communication, push down as a leader. You can't often share everything. Some stuff is sensitive, but make sure that you've shared as much as you possibly can and that you've quelled any disinformation that's going around, which is often what unnerves most people. Make sure that people know your door is always open, that you're there as an active listener to sort of be there to support and hear people who are worried and concerned about difficult times that you're going through. And I think, whether it's in good times or bad, a good leader has also to be a good coach. So to help people, if they're not adapting to the new norm of perhaps having to accept a bit more risk in the environment, coach them, help them to culturally as well fit in to the company that you're in.
Obviously, I appreciate you have your coaching business now. It was one of the drivers to set that up because you did kind of experience that going through your career, and it was something really beneficial, or how did that come about?
No, absolutely the opposite, actually.
Really?
Yes,
Gosh.
the opposite. I had one coaching session in my career. I had a few things around development courses, but I had one coaching session in my early 30s when I was stepped into that Unilever UK role I talked about earlier. Where I learned a real life lesson. It was one of the most powerful hours I'd spent when in a few minutes, to summarize what that session taught me, was that I personally was a perfectionist. And what I've learned through my coaching is that most lawyers are perfectionists, which leads us then often to lack confidence because we have this terrible sort of imposter syndrome feeling that we should know the answer to every single legal question that is thrown our way, which of course is completely unrealistic and is not what our business partners, our clients want. They just want us to solve their problems, whether or not we can do it straight away with an answer or, take it away and give them the answer. So I learned in that session that I had to be able to handle with authenticity and perhaps a smile and laughter that statement, I don't know. I don't know, but I will find out for you. And that may come naturally to some people, but to most people, it's a learning point that they have to find their way of getting used to doing that. Then jump forward from there to 2010 when I stepped into this chief legal officer role, and jump forward again to 2018 when I left Unilever. I look back in 2018 to 2010. I looked at how I'd stepped into those massive roles of chief legal officer and group company secretary. And I was proud of how I had handled the leadership challenges that I stepped into, but I sort of did a little. When I thought back, I had massive imposter syndrome. And, I was sitting in these bodies with these executive committees and the board with these senior people that I was in awe of. And it took me a while to manage my confidence, to find where I could add value, to find my voice. And I got there. I mean, I stayed in that environment for the next 8 years. But when I left in 2018, I look back and I could feel without a shadow of a doubt, had I had a coach, in a little space like this, once a month or whatever it might be, to go to reflect with, to think about why a relationship wasn't working well or how I could have more impact, I would have been far more effective in that role, far quicker. And I probably would have been happier at that point, because having a lack of confidence is quite draining of energy. So that's why I do it now, because I know how much value it can add to people to take that time out to reflect and work through issues that need to be worked through.
In your career to date, can we have a chat about kind of a mistake that you've perhaps made and, how you've dealt with it and how you've learned from it?
Yes, of course. And in fact, in my coaching, I very much open myself up, and I do say to my coachees, do ask me any questions that you'd like of me and my career and perhaps how I handled aspects of it. And I do remember one coachee saying to me, "Did you ever make any mistakes?" As if my answer was going to be no, never. Of course we make mistakes. We make them all the time, and we learn from those mistakes. And I think it is how you learn from those mistakes and perhaps how you go on and coach other people in your team to sort of stop them making the same mistakes as well that is so important. I can think of two mistakes that I made probably that shaped me. The first was in the very early days in Unilever, and we had been working on disbanding a sort of distribution setup. It took a lot of time, a lot of effort. We had to send out lots of termination letters, and as I sent them all out, and it was all done by signing paper and envelopes at that time, they'd all gone, and I suddenly realised we'd made a mistake in terms of counting the days that we needed for the notice period. And I remember my boss at that time had this phrase that every problem is an opportunity. And so I took the lift up to the executive floor, and just as the doors opened, he was there leaving for the night. And I just said to him, Steve, I've got an opportunity for you. He turned round, we walked to his office, we worked through it. It was tough, but we sorted it out. And I learned really from that, when you make a mistake, own up to it, ask for help. The worst thing you can do is to bury it and fret about it. It then becomes far bigger and probably far worse than it should be. So, but I wish I had learned from that enough that jump forward probably 15 years to my second example, which was when I was very senior, and I was sitting with one of the Unilever board committees, a really difficult point being debated, and Unilever was listed in the UK, the Netherlands, and the US. So there was always a massive amount of different regulations and rules to think about as decisions were being made. And as this debate was raging, I had this gut feeling that there was a barrier from one of those sets of listing rules. But I didn't have the confidence, and I don't know why, but I didn't in that moment have the confidence to stick up my hand and say, I think we might have a problem. Let me go away and check it. That would have been my instinct always to do that. But in that one moment, I didn't. And the outfall of that, when I did go away and check, and I was right, and I then had to go back round the whole committee members to tell them, sorry, we need to do an about turn. It was embarrassing. It probably did impact a little bit on my credibility in the moment. You can always build back up credibility. But my learning from that was go with your gut. And, back to this point about confidence we said earlier, it's better to stick up a hand and say, I'm not sure, leave it with me and I'll find the answer, than to sit and not speak at all. So
absolutely. And I think that really plays into kind of what you spoke about earlier about lawyers typically being that kind of perfectionist mindset and kind of needing to have the answers and needing to, somehow have everything in your head, instead of, being able to take a moment and, to work out what is and what isn't. So, I think that's super important. And I think it's also reassuring, I think, to a lot of people to hear that you still went through something like that at the level of seniority that you were, because although I can imagine it was very challenging at the time and obviously not what you want to happen, but it just goes to say that kind of at all levels, things happen, and and being able to kind of have that confidence, whether you're first in your training contract or a CLO, it is challenging the whole way through. And I think that's not very reassuring, is it?
But it's how you handle it, isn't it? It is just getting on with it and trying to solve the issue and reaching out to people, talking to people, engaging with people, rather than burying your head in the sand or trying to avoid it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So, given your extensive experience across a variety of boards, obviously more recently at EY, but even at Unilever as well, I'm going to kind of go straight to the point here. Do you think that GCs should be on the board? Do you think that's where they belong? What's your view on that?
Yeah, and the word board you've just used there could spread across executive committees through to company boards. So maybe my views on all of them, if you like. Interestingly, when I became Chief Legal Officer, I sat with the board. I sat with the executive committee. I was not a member of. In those days, donkey's years ago now, 2010, the feeling still was very much then that the GC should be the objective advisor. They shouldn't be part of that team. They should be in the team, but slightly removed, in order to be the sort of conscience of the company and to give a bit more independence of advice. I don't believe that now. I don't think that is the right strategy. I absolutely believe that the GC should be a fully blown member of an executive team. And, it takes time for somebody who's, leading a function, and then comes into that new executive team. It often takes time, I find, through my coaching, for people to work out how they can add value outside of the law. that's a different point. But I think that the lawyers should be members of the team, and they need to build, and these two words I use a lot, trust and credibility. They will have that coming into an executive committee through their role as a lawyer, but to continue to build on that with their executive colleagues, so that their judgment, and advice in areas, as I said, outside of the law is just as well received as within. I think then if you move into the boards of companies, if I think of, say, my Unilever experience, very often, or listed company experience, very often I think it's generally the CEO and the CFO who are the two executive directors in a board with non-executives. And I think that's right. I'm not sure that I advocate for a GC to become an executive director. I think the GC plays a very powerful role then in board meetings and outside of board meetings, doing their role, which is, the expert legal advice, managing the legal transactions or whatever it might be, keeping the board well briefed on legal risks. So I think that is well organised. And I think, as I said, generally, I think most boards are set up like that. When it then comes to the non-exec side of things, and here's my little plug, we're still, and have been for many years in the UK, disappointed that chairmen don't often look and ask for lawyers, legal experience, as the next Ned that they want on their board. The US, of course, a completely different position where, weighty GC roles will step into a number of non-exec roles. I think that's a real shame in the UK, because in my opinion, the skills that a lawyer has, the ability to digest a massive amount of information and be able to slice it and dice it from both the sort of complete strategic oversight and then deep dive into specific points. So that skill, the skill of asking challenging questions, perhaps, being brave enough to address an elephant in the room, holding the mirror up to people, all of those types of skills that lawyers have abundantly are just the same types of skills I believe that non-execs need to have. So I'm disappointed that there aren't more ex-GCs in corporate boardrooms.
I suppose kind of from an advice perspective, kind of once you have got through the door, you've got a seat at the table, kind of whether that is on the kind of, board side, Ned side in a committee, how do you kind of recommend that people bring that legal perspective into that conversation?
So I think stepping up into an executive committee as the lawyer in the executive committee, how do you bring the legal advice and skills into that environment? Should be easy. You should have your own slot on the committee to update, or the committee, or executive committee to update your colleagues as to the key legal risks. I used to always feel thrilled, maybe too strong a word, but if I had my executive colleagues, divisional heads, or even the CEO, if they were the ones raising the legal issues that were part of their part of the business, I would then be so proud of my legal team that, the legal advice was so well embedded into the sort of performance issues of the different parts of the business that it didn't need to be me, updating people. It came naturally up through the general business risks. So that's how I think that the legal side comes into the executive committee. But as I said before, I think once you're in an executive committee, you are more than a lawyer, and you have to be. And so often in my coaching of people who are stepping into their first sort of GC role, or maybe divisional counsel role, people need to take time to reflect on where outside of the law they naturally can add value. It tends not to be in the sort of financial arena. Lawyers don't particularly feel that, and I think that's right. There are trained accountants in those teams, that they're not the ones to nitpick on the numbers. But invariably, if you ask lawyers, where else naturally would you go to as you prepare for an executive meeting and think about your comments and your contributions and questions, it's similar areas people come up with. It's risk generally, it's the reputation of the company, it's ethical issues, and even being able to say, look, I can speak up for the employee in the executive, how employee communication might land. And, I am an employee and I can speak for the employee. But it takes preparation, it takes time, it takes practice for a lawyer to be able to start contributing, more than just the law in the executive committees. When it comes to being a non-exec with past legal experience in the boardroom, the challenge is the same as for any NED. It's the challenge is, as much as you might be excited about hearing something that was your own specialisation and experience, a transaction or a piece of litigation, when you're in the boardroom as a NED, you have an oversight role. You're not there as the expert in the room, and you really have to manage the fine line between treading on executives' toes and delving down into operational issues unless you're asked to go there and to give advice. And so I think the best thing that you can do from your own experience of the past litigation matters you are in are just to make sure that everything is covered, that they have thought of all the different areas, challenge them perhaps a bit more widely in terms of communication issues that are linked to legal issues, or how are you going to implement the transaction once you've done it. So really try and bring and place whatever legal comments and challenges you have as a non-exec into a more proactive business setting.
I'm also just going to ask, I appreciate it doesn't kind of naturally segue, but in terms of reporting lines for kind of GCs, heads of legal, and I suppose really just the top end of the legal department in kind of any structure, do you have any thoughts on that, of kind of reporting into the CEO, reporting into the CFO as kind of the two main contentious lines, I suppose?
Mm-hmm. I would absolutely say CEO. I think the status of in-house lawyers has risen dramatically, even, in my in-house lifetime. When I took over as chief legal officer, we didn't have lawyers even at the right levels on executive committees in country, in regions. And as I said at that point, even at the chief legal officer stage, it was an attendee to the executive rather than a member. I think that's wrong. I think you need to have lawyers that are there with the people that they're giving advice to in the same executive teams, helping for the business to be shaped and, to get the best performance out of it. And I think, to start from the top and tone from the top, if the chief legal officer is not reporting to the CEO, then you don't get that same status, or get the status that I've been saying, is required. And I think another reason why I would support the CEO is that at the top, in the executive committee, the general counsel needs to be the, hopefully, sort of confidant of the CEO. The judgment that and the advice that a good general counsel who is business focused and knows appropriately how to manage risk, if he or she has the trust of the CEO, then that CEO should be coming to the general counsel on areas completely outside of the law to ask for opinions and judgments. What do you think? Should I fire this person or whatever? That's the type of relationship you're hoping that the GC and the CEO will build together. And I think the reporting line helps to cement that.
No, absolutely. And I think it does go to say, the whole conversation I think about in-house lawyers more recently has been that kind of stepping out of a strictly legal position. And I think you're right in saying at all levels, obviously, we've just spoke about the kind of GC CEO relationship, but, even if you're a senior legal counsel and you're working with the business, you need to kind of go beyond just the strict legal stuff and really understand what the business is doing, what they're trying to achieve, so that you can be that bit more kind of pragmatic and, kind of really advise kind of in a bit of a wider sense. So it's interesting that I think that kind of narrative really trickles down, the entire kind of legal business relationship. Okay, fantastic. I am going to typically ask a recruitment question, but do you have any kind of top lessons, tips, or kind of experiences that you would share in terms of recruiting and building a team?
So in terms of recruitment now, I may be a little bit out of date, but I think the legal roles are so unique that you are recruiting for. It may be that you're looking for some specialist legal experience. It may be that you want some legal ops experience. But in my experience, an internal HR recruitment team are not often best placed to be able to sift through the CVs that you've got and to work out whether or not that CV suggests the person's got the experience that you need. So my advice would be, be hands-on, be there in sort of sifting through, maybe not all of them, but at least a sort of long list of CVs to make sure that you're there looking for what you want and need. And then once you're in there interviewing candidates, for me, culture is such a big thing. I love culture. I'm passionate about culture in all of its senses and guises. And I think when you're interviewing somebody, you get a gut feeling whether this person will fit in culturally into your team and into the business. And it also perhaps culturally in its wider sense as well, and spanning into the risk point we made as well. You can tell through asking the right questions in an interview whether this lawyer has the right risk appetite, the right way of talking, not overly legal and more in a relaxed sort of business sense, whether they will fit in and gel within your environment. And the fact that they might not fit in with your company doesn't mean that they're not well suited for another company. You've just got to be true to yourself as to what you need at that point in time.
No, absolutely. I completely agree. I think it makes a massive difference when hiring managers are very hands-on with recruitment. I mean, as you say, if you've got to the point where you're building a team, you know that team better than everyone. You're going to know what kind of skills you need and what kind of soft skills you need, and you might not get both, but you'll be able to, as you say, kind of be the best person to make that decision.
I've really enjoyed that. So thank you so much for letting me have the opportunity to reflect upon areas of my past and my experience, both positive and negative. It's always good to think back and reflect and remember.